Hi, this is Bob Apt. I'm a forest economist at NC State University. Me and my colleagues on this slide have been looking at southern forest markets, and one aspect of what we've been looking at lately is pellets and forest carbon. I'm going to give you an overview. No, I'm not. Hi, this is Bob Apt. I'm a forest economist at NC State University. I've been modeling the southern forest markets for most of my career. And today I'm trying to give you a brief accelerated overview of what my research shows and try to explain why it shows that. I've got a lot of information. I accidentally went through this just a few minutes ago without turning record on, so hopefully I'll be able to make it through on time. So I built my model trying to take the basic idea that I don't think anyone can really predict demand very well, but forest shouldn't be that hard to predict, at least over the next 10 or 20 years in the US South, because we have pretty good data on what's out there now and its age, and so we should be able to grow it out and see what's going to happen in the future. I'm able to build an empirical based model because we have a really good database that's been maintained over decades that captures information on mortality, removals, growth by forest type, species group, product class, and owner group. So that's the database I'm building my empirically driven model on. I spend most of my time answering two types of questions: demand side questions, which would be, for example, capacity, sawmill capacity moving into the South because of sort of record profit levels, and what would happen in a particular region if we increase the demand based on a new mill. And then the supply side issues that I'm dealing with lately are how will intensive management or hazards like hurricanes affect markets in specific areas. Today I'm going to try to take an ambitious agenda for 15 minutes and give you a quick, fast overview of the status of forests in the South, which provides the context for understanding how pellets might affect that context in terms of what happens to forest carbon. If you're unfamiliar, pine plantations are the dominant source of removals. It's over 2/3 of pine removals, and over almost half of all removals come off of pine plantations, yet it's only 24% of the forest resource. And so I spend a lot of time modeling what's happening in pine plantations, which is convenient because they're much easier to model than the other forest types. But it is really a pretty small part of the landscape. And as we'll see, it's not the source of carbon stocks, it is the source of carbon sequestration. I wanted to point out before I completely abandon looking at real carbon data and look at above ground forest data, that there is a high correlation. The data on the right is from a US Forest Service study, Colston and Ware pointed out, and you can see that over the same time period, my graph of above ground carbon merchantable volume is pretty well the same trend line that you see above ground tree carbon. And I'm also point out that I'm ignoring, like many modelers, what's happening to soil carbon and to other carbon pools. But what's happening to the merchantable volume on private land in the South is the driver of what's happening to forest carbon, above ground forest carbon in the US South. This is to sort of validate that if you want to know where the carbon stock is in the US South, the upper left shows that it's dominated by upland hardwoods. It's the most common forest type, and it's generally 50 to 80 years old. If you want to know where the carbon sequestration occurs in the US South, the graph on the right shows that's dominated by pine plantations. Right? There's no coincidence there. Those plantations aren't allowed to grow old enough to become a significant stock, and the upland hardwoods are not harvested intensely enough to stay in the fast growing stage. And you can see the area graph in the lower left, and you can see upland hardwoods are a much bigger part of the landscape than pine plantations. Before I move on into details, I do want to make a couple notes about empirical versus optimization models of forest behavior, especially as it affects forest carbon. Right, the harvest decision is probably the key variable in a model that's managing or modeling the management and extent of forests and the carbon stocks. It's a critical variable. Both the sequestration rate and the carbon storage are dominated by that decision. Most private optimization models pretty much use a version of the Faustman because there's not much alternative. There's the Hartmann rotation that takes into account some other things to drive harvest decisions, and that's the way you would make an optimal decision. But I want to take a moment to point out that there's possibly pretty big consequences on what happens on the landscape based on what people actually do versus what they would optimally do, even on pine plantations. So this is upland hardwoods. We've seen this, the major carbon stock. You can see quickly at this that the Faustman rotation would be 30, you'd be harvesting at 38 years, but the average harvest or the peak of harvest is around 52, which is coincidentally pretty close to what the net present value max is. In other words, the first thinking of just one rotation, you would harvest at 52. Faustman brings in the thought of thinking about future rotations. So if you just think about the consequences of assuming a Faustman harvest and what the carbon stocks would look like on upland hardwoods versus what we actually see, which is 15 to 20 years longer. But even on pine plantations in the region that has the most intensive management, the Faustman rotation would be around 23 years, and we see that over half of pine plantation harvest occurs after the Faustman age. And it's not shown on this graph, but the note at the bottom points out that there's corporate-owned plantations and non-corporate-owned plantations, and there's quite a difference in behavior between those. So even if you control for forest type, if you don't control for ownership, you'd get a biased result on what you would expect harvests to be. Timberland area in the south, this has been pretty constant. That's the green line on top is the total. The main dynamic has been the pine plantations replacing natural pine. That's the arrows in the middle of the graph. But if you notice in the last decade or longer, maybe 15 to 20 years, the decline in natural pine has stopped and the increase in pine plantations has leveled off. So that dynamic has changed. And in the last decade or so, the forest type mix has stayed relatively constant. This is a different view of the same kind of idea. If you look at land use change in the south, you see the pixels lighting up. That's because they say it's both a loss and gain in forest land, but it's really a harvest. It never left the forest land use, it just changed its cover. If you look at maps that actually try to control for land use, you can see these green areas here are where more than 5% of the ag land actually changed to a forest use. So, and again, compared to the rest of the US South is where almost all of that dynamic occurs. So it's dynamic because it's privately owned, largely unregulated, and it's been studied a lot. Lebowski did his dissertation on this topic and identified timber net returns as the most important factor driving this increase. So what does this mean if we think about pellets and carbon? And then the question is, can pellets actually influence returns to forest land? In other words, to have this sort of positive influence. And historically, pine saw timber has been the primary rent driver. Low value products like pulpwood, which is what closest to what pellet mills use, not so much. So if pellet mills are in that category, it's going to be hard for them to move the needle on rents. For that to happen, right, the difference between pine saw timber and pine pulpwood prices needs to decrease. And pellets need to be a big enough share of the pulpwood market to have an influence on prices. If you look at the historical data, you can see that 2005, there was a 5.5 or so to 1 ratio between saw timber and pulpwood. Now it's about 2.5 to 1. So in fact, pine pulpwood is now part of the rent calculation. You can see pulpwood prices have been trending up, saw timber prices have been trending down. So yes, we've met one condition, pine pulpwood prices have become more important in the land rent calculation. How about pellets? Well, pellets have been going up since about 2009 when Enviva started production. They've been on a pretty steady increase. But if you put it in the context of the paper industry, there's a couple things to note. The blue line is pine pulpwood consumption by non-pellets, and that would be paper dominantly, maybe some OSB. But the thing to note there is pine pulpwood consumption without pellets is at an all-time high. So that even though pellets are only 15% of the market, they're an important increase on top of the highest we've ever had. So that exaggerates or at least intensifies their price influence. What do pellet mills use? This is from Forestry, who works in this space. What they call residuals is really a lot of things. Mill residues, chips made from roundwood in the woods and hauled to the mill. Some of it is softwood pulpwood that enters the mill as chips, but you can see that it's dominated by softwood pulpwood and probably softwood residuals. Side note on the right, which I don't really have time to go into much, was in Viva in North Carolina, Virginia is hardwood, but that's largely because they came in after the closure of a hardwood pulp mill. So we are still not at peak pellets capacity still going in, which is the green facilities. You can see they're concentrated in the Atlantic area where I am and in the Gulf states. So are they big enough to have a price effect? So Bruno da Silva, a PhD student now at Mississippi State, did this work. He used Forestry markets, micro market data, and he marked the survey or the micro market regions that had pellet mills and looked at the influence of pellet mills on prices. And you can see pretty clearly that the areas with and without pellet mills followed the same price trend up until around 2009. And the areas with pellet mills went on a significant increase. So are they big enough to have an influence on prices? And I say yes, not because they're so huge, although they are significant, but they're entering the market at a time when overall demand for pine pulp was all-time high. So now we've met the two conditions for pellets to affect forest rents. So what does that mean when you put it in the model? Well, this runs from when we were trying to understand how big pellets would be, but turns out we guessed about right about how big pellets would be. And so when I put that pellet demand in the model, I did get a rent effect. And you can see that what happened is pine plantation forest carbon, the dotted lines are the with pellets, actually went up a slight amount. The rest of the forest, this isn't just natural pine, but just the carbon, forest carbon on naturally regenerative stations, right? It did not change the trend. It was going up and leveling off. It's just leveling off at a slightly different level. And if you add those two together, the total forest carbon outlook is a slight increase. Now, one thing to remember is that there's a lot of debate about the carbon debt story. Well, the carbon debt story is a stand level story, but when pellets move into a market, what they do immediately when they start buying wood is have a price effect. And so you don't wait until the trees grow up to have a market effect. The price effect starts as soon as the demand starts. And so you can start seeing the consequences of extra demand immediately. And matter of fact, the effect levels off and it actually just sort of changed the cycle of forest carbon, and it's actually lower in the out years. So I'm not doing carbon accounting. I just want to make a couple points really quickly. Is the counterfactual in the south for trees that aren't being managed or used for pellets is they are not slow-growing trees with uncertain regeneration. They're fast-growing trees that will be harvested for something. So the counterfactual is not that trees will stay there and continue to sequester carbon. It's they'll go to some other use and probably not carbon beneficial, at least at the pulpwood market stage. And if we didn't have markets or land use or management response, the carbon story would be worse as well. So the first two are basically modeling assumptions, the small area plots and the short timeframes. But the last three are just happenstance in that the area where the pellet mills have located, maybe uniquely in the world, have these traits that makes the carbon story very market sensitive. And in fact, they now have a present big enough to affect markets. So this is just a summary. I I've already said all of this. The one thing I should note is ag markets matter too. I was holding ag markets constant in these runs, but if our ag markets, if the technology in ag frees up land for timber in the South, it will turn into timber, whether it's managed that way or not. So that's a carbon gain. But if ag markets become strong, or whether the demand for land becomes strong, then forest land will be lost to agriculture. But that's driven more about what's happening in the agriculture markets than what's happening in the forest markets. So with that, I'll stop. I think I'm 1 minute over. I appreciate your attention. And if there's any questions, you can email me at this email address. Thank you.